Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 20 July, 2025. It is the 721st anniversary of the birth of Francesco Petrarch, who was born in Arezzo, at that time an independent city-state, on this date in 1304. Petrarch himself tells us that the 20th of July in 1304 was a Monday, and that he was born at dawn. There are many spellings in use for Petrarch's name, so I'm going to use the form that's most familiar to me, and I'm going to use the form of pronunciation that's most familiar to me, even if it's not exactly historically accurate. Petrarch's life was entirely contained within the 15th century, so he lived from 1304 to 1374. In fact, he died one day short of his 70th birthday. A decade after his death, Arezzo was absorbed into the Grand Duchy of Tuscany after having been for a time a Ghibelline rival of Guelph Florence. In Western historiography, it's conventional to identify the period from 1500 to 1800 as early modern, so that Petrarch's life just before this in the 1400s is neatly contained within the final century of medieval history. And by this measure, Petrarch was a man of the Middle Ages. But one of the reasons last year I discussed Petrarch's account of his ascent of Mount Ventoux was because this episode has been identified symbolically by some as an essentially modern episode, making Petrarch, by extension, already a modern man. In particular, I quoted Hans Blumenberg, who wrote that Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux was, quote, one of the great moments that oscillate indecisively between the epochs, unquote. Because while on the one hand, Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux was a modern example, or a somewhat modern example, of climbing a mountain just for the sake of the view, on the other hand, we can interpret Petrarch's journey as being as pervasively symbolic as Dante's journey from hell through purgatory to heaven in the Divine Comedy. And Petrarch gives us plenty of symbolic hints in his letter that his ascent was as much spiritual as physical. In other words, Petrarch's Ventoux expedition was an admixture of the medieval and the modern, and like Blumenberg says, oscillating between the past and the present. The difficulty of classifying Petrarch's proper epoch is reflected in the historiographical tradition around him and his work, and it was even shared by Petrarch himself, as we'll see. If you read histories of medieval philosophy, you'll find that Petrarch isn't usually mentioned in them, even though he was a close contemporary of thinkers like, for example, Jean Buridan, who was a source of the amusing paradox of Buridan's ass, who starved to death halfway between two equally enticing piles of hay. The exact dates of Buridan's death and birth aren't known, but like Petrarch, he seems to have lived out his 70 approximately in the first 3/4 of the 15th century. Jean Buridan does appear in histories of medieval philosophy, since he was very much part of the spirit of his time and a man of his time. He exemplified the later developments of scholastic philosophy in a way that Petrarch did not. There's no mention of Petrarch in Gordon Leff's widely available history, medieval thought from St. Augustine to Occam, and there's no mention of Petrarch in David Knowles' equally widely available book, The Evolution of Medieval Thought. And of course, Petrarch doesn't figure in Copleston's Medieval Philosophy, or Richard McKeon's selections from medieval philosophers. And Petrarch is mentioned only twice in the Cambridge History of Later Medieval Philosophy, and that just to tell us that Petrarch wasn't a philosopher, but rather an independent man of letters. What Petrarch does feature in are histories of Renaissance philosophy. He figures prominently in Paul Oscar Christeller's Renaissance Thought, the Classic, Scholastic, and Humanist Strains, and the anthology edited by Christeller, Cassirer, and Randall the Renaissance philosophy of man. That Petrarch isn't classed among the medieval philosophers who were his exact historical contemporaries tells us something important. Petrarch was, in Nietzsche's terms, untimely. The Gospels tell us that a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. And L.P. Hartley told us that the past is a foreign country. From these two sources, we can assemble the perspective that a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, but also with the exception of his own time. Except that Petrarch was honored in his own time, and quite conspicuously so. He tells us that princes and prominent men sought out his friendship, and that while residing in Vaucluse near Avignon on the same day, the 1st of September 1340, he received invitations from both the Senate of Rome and the Chancellor of the University of Paris to be crowned poet laureate. He chose the Roman invitation, stopping at Naples before heading to Rome to be further flattered by the king there. And many of the portraits of Petrarch show him crowned with a laurel as a result of this. One of the themes of Petrarch's work was his desire for fame, and in this he seems to have been rewarded proportionately to his desires, although he was never fully content with his status. In this, he was like the great artists of his time who were sought out and honored as conspicuously as Petrarch was honored by various city-states and kingdoms. And these are the artists we associate with the early Renaissance. Art historians have pushed the origins of the Renaissance always deeper into medieval history, so that, for example, the frescoes of Giotto, an older contemporary of Petrarch who was born in the 13th century, and Masaccio, a closer contemporary of Petrarch as well as of Buridan, are counted as part of the Renaissance and not as part of medieval art. There's a specific term for this in art history, namely the Quattrocento. So we could call Petrarch a Quattrocento philosopher, but this would be a highly unusual usage since the historiography of art history is almost never applied to the historiography of philosophy. So what differentiates Petrarch's late medieval thought from the late medieval thought of Buridan? We could ask by the same token, what distinguishes Quattrocento art from contemporaneous medieval art? One of the most charming things about medieval art is what I would call a near total absence of historical consciousness, or what might be better called a different form of historical consciousness than what we have today. Two works of art in particular stand out in my mind in this respect. The first time I traveled to Europe alone, I went to Munster and I visited the Westphalian State Museum of Art and Cultural History. And there I saw a sculpture group that depicted the trial of Christ before Pilate. But Pilate was no Roman governor that any Roman would recognize. Pilate was a medieval burgher, and the townsfolk who were part of the sculpture group were medieval townsfolk. Anyone who knows medieval art will be familiar with this, but it was new to me at the time, and so I was struck by it. This collection was reorganized in a new building in 2014, and it may have been reorganized several times since I was there 35 years ago. But I don't know if the sculptures to which I'm referring are still on display, but this stays with me because it was a key moment in my aesthetic education, and probably the moment when I began to be interested in medieval art. For those who are watching and not just listening to this episode, the picture behind me is another sculpture group from the medieval period, but one I saw in Warsaw in 2023, and not the one I saw 35 years ago, which I could not find a picture of. Another work of art I found similarly striking is a small painting in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid, depicting an episode from the legend of Jason and the Argonauts, specifically the departure from Colchis. The legend of Jason and the Argonauts is an ancient Greek story. In fact, it's among the earliest known of Greek legends. But the ship and the people on the ship in the painting were all obviously from the late 15th century. It would be easy to produce any number of examples to similar effect, but I saw these when I was still relatively young, and impressionable, and they brought home to me the distinctive relationship of medieval civilization to its past, both its historical past and its mythological past. In one sense, as I said, this is an absence of historical consciousness. But in another sense, this is another form of historical consciousness, and I'll return to that in a bit. Kenneth Clark, who was an art historian before he made his television series Civilization, which focuses, not surprisingly, on art history, said that the first paintings to show an awareness of the historical past as we now understand it were Andrea Mantegna's Triumphs of Caesar in the Gonzaga Ducal Palace at Mantua. These date from 1484 to 1492, so from about the same time as the painting of the departure from Colchis. Clark wrote, quote, "The humanists who took so much trouble about the text of an author like Livy accepted as a correct representation of the event a picture of the death of Julius Caesar in which figures are obviously dressed like 15th century dandies. As long as there was this rather comical discrepancy between the written word and the image, antiquity could not exercise its humanizing power on the imagination. I suppose that the first occasion in which the dream of antiquity is given more or less accurate visible form is a series of decorations representing the triumph of Caesar done for the court of Mantua by Mantegna in about 1480. It is the first piece of romantic archaeology," unquote. As Clark implies, humanist philosophers took great pains to reconstruct the literary milieu of classical antiquity, but it was another step to reconstruct the visual representation of the past, and this didn't happen until after Petrarch's death. But Petrarch was a part of the effort to reconstruct this literary milieu of classical antiquity with which he closely identified himself. A theme running through Petrarch's writings is how out of place he is in his world and how he yearned to be part of the ancient world. He wrote a number of letters to ancient authors as though they were his contemporaries, including letters to Cicero, to Seneca, Varro, Quintilian, Livy, and several others. And in his letter to Cicero, Petrarch wrote, quote, "Your letters I sought for long and diligently, and finally, where I least expected it, I found them. At once I read them over and over with the utmost eagerness. And as I read, I seemed to hear your bodily voice, O Marcus Tullius, saying many things, uttering many lamentations, ranging through many phases of thought and feeling," unquote. Given Petrarch's own habit of writing letters and publishing them, it's really easy to understand his interest in Cicero's letter. And Petrarch immersed himself in the ancient world to the extent that he could through its literature, some of which he recovered, like the letters of Cicero, and he read and he copied and he emulated in his own works. For example, Petrarch worked on a collection of lives loosely based on Plutarch's parallel lives, which remained unfinished at his death and which, more than 700 years later, still haven't been translated into English. This book is usually referred to as On Illustrious Men. This is an example of what Nietzsche called monumental history, what Heidegger called historical ideals of life, and what I call exemplarism. Ostensibly, these are biographies, but the point of the book was moral instruction. And in this sense, Petrarch still conforms to the medieval conception of history that we find in his contemporaries and those before him in the medieval tradition. But even as he expands this medieval tradition, Petrarch modifies it. He finds exemplars in Republican Rome, among the church fathers, and from all ages, as he says in one letter, quote, "bringing together illustrious men from all lands and countries." In my episode on Schopenhauer, I mentioned the Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César, mostly concerned with the exemplary history of Alexander the Great, and which embodies an ahistorical conception of history in which nothing essential changes, in which the world always has been what it is and always will be as it is. The Fêtes des Romains continues this with the life of Julius Caesar, which is taken as the paradigmatic historical ideal of life. In that episode, I attributed to Schopenhauer a categorical conception of history in which any one history is as good as any other history because all history is the same. While Petrarch is on board with the medieval tradition of exemplary history, he recognizes that something has changed between the time of classical antiquity, which he admires, and his own time, of which he expresses much less admiration. In this way, histories, then still primarily considered to be a form of moral instruction, became more pluralistic. There's not just the history of Alexander the Great or the history of Caesar, and these being understood as equivalent to the histories of recent events in the categorical conception of history, but there are histories that are radically different from the history of our own time, or in Petrarch's case, the history of his own time. With Petrarch, history becomes different from our time or his time, rather than being one big repetition of the same over and over again. The past was different. And for Petrarch, the past was also better. In another letter to Cicero, he wrote, quote, "You have heard what I think of your life and your genius. Are you hoping to hear of your books also, what fate has befallen them, how they are esteemed by the masses and among scholars? They still are in existence, glorious volumes, but we of today are too feeble a folk to read them, or even to be acquainted with their mere title. Your fame extends far and wide. Your name is mighty and fills the ears of men. And yet those who really know you are very few, be it because the times are unfavorable, or because men's minds are slow and dull, or, as I am the more inclined to believe, because the love of money forces our thoughts in other directions," unquote. In the same way that art historians find traces of the Renaissance earlier and earlier in medieval history, I could say that Petrarch constitutes the earliest form of historical consciousness that would eventually become historicism, though not in Popper's sense of historicism, but in Ronca's sense of historicism. Petrarch's expansion of historical consciousness extended both to the past and to the future. He demonstrated historical consciousness with respect to the past with his letters to Cicero and letters to Seneca, and he demonstrated his historical consciousness of the future with his letter to posterity. The letter to posterity is an unfinished autobiography that breaks off abruptly, as in fact all lives break off abruptly without any real explanation. But the fact that Petrarch presents the story of his life in the form of a letter to posterity, saying that in the off chance that his name survives, those who have heard of him might like to know what his life was like and what kind of man he was, and he was right about that, shows us that he was thinking in terms of a future that would see his own times as their past. We could say that this owes as much to St. Augustine as to modernity, as Augustine wrote his Confessions for much the same reason, that is to say, to recount the story of a life and to tell us what kind of man he was. Petrarch was an admirer of Augustine, and especially of Augustine's Confessions. It was a copy of Augustine's Confessions that Petrarch brought with him on his ascent of Mount Ventoux, opening and reading a passage that is one of the key symbolic moments in Petrarch's letter about his expedition to Mount Ventoux. The expansion of historical consciousness that Petrarch represents is a step away from the categoricity of medieval historians and Schopenhauer, and an approximation of the formal complementarity that I discussed in my second episode on Copernicus. That we have a posterity that will look back on us as their past is complementary to the fact that we have a past for which we are the posterity. This is the same temporal relationship displaced from the present into the future. And this is ultimately based on a metaphysical uniformitarianism of time. Time past is structurally like time present, and time present will be structurally like time future. I should say time future will be structurally like time present and time past, for that matter. We may find ourselves living in different ages of the world's history, but our experience of time is structurally invariant. This kind of invariance of temporal experience could also be claimed for Schopenhauer's categorical historicity. So there's a relationship among invariant structures of history and how they relate to the individual's experience of their own time. The differentia between these two conceptions of temporal structure, which I could call the categorical and the complementary, is historical consciousness. In the categorical account of history, historical consciousness is invariant. The costumes change over time, but the mind of man is the same. In the complementarity account of history, temporal structures are invariant, but historical consciousness is relative to some period of time and changes from epoch to epoch. Not only do costumes change, but men's minds change along with the fashion of their dress. Raymond Aron wrote in his Dimensions of Historical Consciousness, which still hasn't been translated into English, quote, "Consciousness of the past is constitutive of historical existence. Man truly has a past only if he is aware that he has one, because only his consciousness introduces the possibility of dialogue and choice. Otherwise, individuals and societies carry within them a past they can ignore, that they passively endure. As long as they are not aware of what they are and what they were, they do not access the proper dimension of history," unquote. Recall that Plutarch, in his letter to posterity, wanted us, who are his posterity, to know what kind of man he was, which is very much consistent with what Aron is saying here. Plutarch then wanted us to access the proper dimension of history, which he did quite explicitly by entering into dialogue with us. He wrote a letter to us that we can still read today. But I don't think that Aron went quite far enough in his account of historical consciousness. Man can be aware that he has a past and still not access the proper dimension of history as Aron sees it. This is because there are, as I implied earlier, different forms of historical consciousness that correspond to different forms of historicity and different periods of history. The categorical historicity of medieval thought truly had a past, but it was not a past as we conceive it today. In some ways, this past was much more immediate and intimate, as it seems to be immediate when Petrarch writes letters to ancient writers dead for more than 1,000 years, as though they were close friends of his. This is Petrarch's categorical heritage. But when he writes a letter to posterity, that is to say, when he writes a letter to us today who are his posterity, his larger and more comprehensive historical framework becomes more evident. This is Petrarch's legacy of complementarity. And while most ancient and medieval history was as much about moral instruction as it was about the past, the complementarity of modern historical consciousness is in its own way no less about moral instruction than medieval history or ancient history. The most familiar and perhaps the most fundamental moral thought experiment is the ability to place yourself in the shoes of someone else. This is an exercise in complementarity. What would it be like to be you? What would it be like to live your life? What would it be like to experience what you experience? Taken individually, it's how we compare our own personal consciousness to that of others. But taken socially, it's how we understand and compare the historical consciousness of different ages. So happy birthday, Petrarch. I'm in receipt of the letter to me as part of the posterity to whom you addressed yourself, and I'm drafting a reply. But for the time being, this is my greeting to you in the 21st century. Thanks for listening.